So if you've been brought up around vocal training culture or even just watched a bunch of content on vocal training, you might have been warned about destroying your voice.
I have nodes.
What? Oh my God.
Even if you haven't been warned about your own voice getting destroyed, you might have heard cautionary tales of different celebrities or singers who have destroyed their voices in some way. However, a complaint that I have with a lot of videos like this is a lack of generalizable scientific data. So today I want to present the science on vocal damage, as well as talking a little bit about some practical advice that I have on preserving your voice and practicing safely. So I'm going to break the video down into two distinct sections. The first section is just going to cover the data that we have on vocal injury. In the second half of the video, I'll just present my own opinions about vocal rehab and vocal health from more of an experiential level as a vocal coach. But I wanted to make that clear up top, so when we go from talking about scientific studies to personal observations, it's not lost. And I've also cited all the articles that I'm going to cover in the description below if you want to check any of them out for yourself. In pretty much every video I've made about different genres, there's at least one person in the comment section arguing that a particular genre or a particular technique will lead to vocal damage. And I don't want to discount these kinds of personal experiences because vocal damage is a really scary thing. It's a really frustrating thing to experience as a singer. So I do want to move ahead with a lot of empathy, and I'm going to offer a lot of hopeful data on recovering from vocal damage as well as part of this section. But now we're going to leap into science and try to look very objectively at what causes vocal damage. So when we're talking about vocal damage in a singing context, we're usually talking about a class of injuries called phonotraumatic injuries. Phonotrauma is just a fancy way of saying that these injuries are caused by actions within the voice itself. This trauma could be chronic and accumulated over many years of singing, or it could be acute and happen in one particular instance of vocalizing. But as a rule, this whole category of injuries is defined by instances of impact and contact within the vocal folds. You can distinguish phonotraumatic injuries, which are use injuries, from things like neurological vocal disorders or carcinogenic polyps, usually induced by tobacco use. While different variations of phonotraumatic injuries may have different causation patterns, generally speaking, they're all characterized by some kind of benign mass on the vocal folds. So something to get out of the way is that phonotraumatic injuries do in fact occur with a higher frequency among vocal professionals. Certain types of vocal injuries are basically confirmed to be caused by singing regularly, by singing a lot. And while that may sound kind of obvious, it's worth providing the actual data for it because we have a good jumping off point to start to talk about vocal injuries. We know that these particular kinds of vocal injuries are more common in singers and performers, which suggests to us that high amount of usage of the vocal folds is a big contributor to these kinds of vocal injuries. Now, building on this, there's also some level of data to support the idea that phonotrauma is related to vocal load. The exact relationship between vocal load, the force that is put into the vocal folds, and phonotrauma is a little bit difficult to define. And there's really no clinical data out there that will tell us exactly how much vocal load the vocal folds can handle before some kind of injury is induced. However, we have good reason to believe that avoidance of injury has a lot to do with load management. It seems that the more often you use your voice and the more force you put through your voice, the higher risk you are for suffering some kind of vocal injury. What's strange about this, though, is that if we then say, okay, well, let's try to see if there's any particular technique that is going to induce these kinds of injuries the most, we're met with really conflicting data. You might, for instance, think that belting, which requires more subglottal pressure than more classical techniques, would induce more vocal damage. We know that in particular vocal techniques, subglottal pressure is increasing. And in fact, sometimes even we know that the extrinsic muscles of the voice are working harder in these same techniques. Interestingly enough, though, the data is very non-conclusive when it comes to genre-based performers and their prevalence to vocal injury. This article by Childs and colleagues in 2022 took 9 years of data from singers who were complaining of phonotraumatic injuries and grouped them by genre. They didn't find that any one particular genre presented with more vocal injuries as a rule. Instead, different genre performers tended to present with statistically more significant rates of particular types of vocal injuries, with praise and gospel singers presenting with a higher rates of polyps, than musical theater singers, opera singers, and choral singers, but also with opera singers presenting with a higher degree of pseudocysts than any of the other genre singers. Kwok and Eslick's meta-analysis from 2019 expressed some interest in trying to figure out if we can determine who by genre is more at risk of suffering particular vocal injuries. But even after they surveyed an array of data on vocal damage, they couldn't find particular trends by genre. So basically what the data suggests to us is that we know that vocal damage is caused by use and potentially overuse, but we don't have a lot of conclusive evidence that a particular style of singing is more risky than another style of singing. Now, I'll say right here that I don't think this means we should just throw out any concern for technique, but we don't really have conclusive evidence that there is a super high risk for pursuing different styles that you might be interested in. On top of this, we also have a lot of encouraging data that phonotrauma is essentially reversible. So while vocal injuries can be really discouraging and professionally debilitating sometimes, there is a path to healing and recovery. In fact, there are many analyses that suggest that vocal therapy alone is a really useful modality for healing from phonotraumatic injury. This doesn't mean that surgery isn't necessary in particular cases, but it is encouraging to see that simple, holistic vocal therapy can make a lot of improvements on the voice. Cohen and colleagues in 2007 found that voice therapy, even without other interventions, led to improved symptoms. Holmberg and colleagues found that a behaviorally based voice therapy protocol resulted in improved symptoms, both in terms of the sound of the voice of people who had suffered vocal injury and in terms of the size of their nodules and lesions. And Estes in 2023 found that performers working with medical professionals and vocal coaches tended to recover at a much faster rate. So what does all this data mean and what should we do about it? The first thing that I'll say is, though we should be concerned about vocal technique, I don't think that we should fearmonger based on particular techniques and styles. A lot of injury history ends up coming down to the individual, so even though there are shared traits between people who suffer vocal injuries, the details that we can assess on those traits at a statistical level is relatively low. On top of this, we have all this amazing hopeful data that vocal injuries are recoverable. So my basic thesis is that while vocal damage is something that none of us want, it shouldn't be talked about in a way where it's being kind of lorded over people as a boogeyman. And some data has indicated that the stigma around vocal injury actually hurts performers, who sometimes have to hide these injuries from people like directors or production coordinators. When these same people simply sought help from medical professionals and voice coaches, they saw a lot of resolution in their symptoms. So with that summary of some of the vocal science behind us, let's talk about some practical advice for vocal rehab. So now that we've broken down the science, what can you actually do to avoid vocal injury or bounce back from it if you've experienced it? I want to share my personal answer to that in 8 steps. And this framework will probably look a lot different from do bad technique, get injured. It's going to be a lot more individualized to that in terms of how you apply it. And really it will come down a lot to the types of training and experience that you already have. So my first principle is to accumulate vocal load in an intelligent, progressive way. So something that is often lost in the idea of vocal technique, in my opinion, is conditioning. It's true in my experience that particular singers can simply handle more force through their voice than other singers can. And a lot of this has to do with things like what kind of techniques you've trained and how long you've been training them. When it comes to techniques like belt or scream, for instance, a lot of vocalists need an accumulation phase where they get used to those techniques in small doses before they can make them really efficient or sustainable. It's probably a good idea if you're interested in a more extreme technique or something that has a lot of vocal load that you're just going to kind of gradually expose yourself to that technique versus diving in the deep end right away. Step number 2 is care for your overall health. Something that is affirmed in some of the studies that I brought up earlier is that things like lifestyle factors and even speaking contribute a lot to vocal injury. Professional performers are under a lot of duress simply from a lifestyle perspective. The voice, like every other part of the body, reacts to things like sleep and diet. If you're particularly susceptible to things like acid reflux, those are some valid concerns that you're just going to want to think about when you're approaching your vocal training. The more you can reduce fatigue that your voice is accumulating from things that are not singing, the more energy you can put into the singing itself. Point number 3 is care for your vocal health, and mostly this boils down to working out the inflammation in your vocal folds on a regular basis. What this looks like practically is warming up and cooling down in a very low impact way. You might have heard of so-called SOVT exercises like the lip trill or straw exercises. Doing these types of exercises in your low range is an incredibly effective way to keep your voice feeling loose and healthy. Number 4 is to adjust your vocals to the demands of your performance. If you're in the recording studio and you have plenty of time between takes, you might be able to push the envelope a little bit on how much force you're putting through your voice. But if you're performing night after night after night, your vocal needs are going to change. If you're doing constant rehearsals with a band, for instance, it might be worth just kind of marking it sometimes, just to give your voice intermittent breaks from the force that you're putting through it. Number 5 is don't panic, and this goes for before or after vocal injury. If you're experiencing some kind of adverse sounds or feeling in your voice, it's worth doing some vocal rehabilitation that's active versus just pure vocal rest. If those symptoms persist, that leads us to number 6, which is seek professional help. It is definitely worth getting an idea of what's going on the inside of the voice if you're experiencing regular chronic dysfunction. Go get a laryngoscopy, go get a consultation on what's happening on the inside of your voice. Number 7, if injured, if you come back and they do find something within that scope, you want to rehab gradually and intelligently. When you're first injured, your voice is not going to be able to handle very much, but gradually we want to start exposing it to some amount of vocalization. Low force vocalization, like we talked about in the warm-ups and cool-downs, for extended periods of time tend to help rehabilitate the voice. Finally, number 8, use rehab as an opportunity to build healthy habits. This doesn't mean that you should fear the vocal techniques you were doing previously, but it might be an indication that there are some types of things you're doing that your voice simply can't handle. Despite how shitty these vocal injuries can really be, there's an opportunity there to start exploring what kind of positions you can get into that are going to preserve your voice better. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video helpful. If you have any vocal questions, drop them in the comments below. If you suspect you might have a vocal injury, please seek some medical help first. But if you're in the rehab process trying to get back to your full strength and need a little bit of guidance, feel free to reach out. I hope that this video has offered kind of a counterpoint to some of the more negative clickbaity videos out there, because as usual, I just want you to feel empowered to sing in the way that you want to. If you're interested in vocal lessons, click the link in my bio, and I'll see you in the next one.